She had $31 left in the world, a field that hadn't produced a real harvest in 3 years, and a town that had already written her off. And on the morning that would change everything, Mara Holloway stood in the mud outside a slaughter pen and made the most reckless decision of her life. 64 rabbits, unwanted, hours from death. The man selling them called her crazy to her face. The price would take nearly everything she had left. She paid it anyway. What happened next? The mockery, the blizzard, the moment an entire county nearly watched her lose it all, begins right here. Stay with me until the end, like this video, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The land had a name before Mara ever set foot on it. People in Redstone Crossing called it the Holloway Patch, and not with any affection. It sat on the western edge of the county, where the soil ran thin over a shelf of clay and the wind came down off the ridge in a way that stripped topsoil and patience in equal measure. 3 generations of Holloways had worked that ground, and 3 generations had barely managed to keep it. When Mara's parents died within a year of each other, her mother from a fever in early spring, her father from a slow accumulation of everything that breaks a man, the land passed to her along with a debt she hadn't known existed, and a reputation for stubbornness she had earned honestly. She was 26 years old. She had no husband, no brothers, no cousins close enough to matter. What she had was the land, a mule named Clover who was getting too old for heavy pulling, and a particular quality that people in Redstone Crossing alternately called determination and stupidity, depending on how the season was going. The first year alone had been the hardest she'd known. She planted late because she didn't understand the drainage patterns the way her father had, and she lost half the corn before it ever tasseled. The second year she planted earlier and lost the seedlings to a late frost that her father would have anticipated by the color of the sky. By the third spring, the spring that matters for this story, she had learned enough to be dangerous and not quite enough to be successful, and she had $31 in a tin box buried beneath the floorboards of her kitchen. The county lender's name was Gideon Mercer. He was not an evil man in the way that people sometimes describe lenders in stories like this. He was practical in the way that a fence post is practical, solid, unbending, and entirely indifferent to what grew on either side of it. He had extended credit to her father years ago, and he had extended it again tomorrow when she came to him in her first autumn alone, hat in hand and jaw set in that way she had, like she was daring him to say no so she could argue with him about it. He had not said no. He had said yes with terms that were reasonable by the standards of the time and brutal by the standards of what she could actually earn from that ground. Miss Holloway, he'd told her when she signed the papers, the land has potential. Whether you do remains to be seen. She had not thanked him for that. The town of Redstone Crossing was not unkind exactly. It was a frontier community, which meant that it had the rough warmth of people who understood hardship and also the rough judgment of people who had survived hardship by being practical. Sentiment was a luxury. Failed ventures were a cautionary tale, not a tragedy. And Mara Holloway, farming alone on the worst piece of ground in the county, was becoming a cautionary tale one season at a time. The women at the dry goods store were kind to her face. The men at the feedlot were respectful in the way that people are respectful to someone they expect to fail quietly and without complication. The banker was polite. The minister was encouraging. Nobody expected her to make it through another winter. She knew this. She wasn't naive, whatever else people thought of her. She sat at her kitchen table on the evenings when she wasn't too tired to think, and she ran the numbers the way her father had taught her, and the numbers were not good. The soil was depleted. 3 generations of planting without proper rotation or amendment had taken something out of the ground that planting alone couldn't put back. She'd tried composting. She'd tried letting sections lie fallow. She'd tried reading everything in the county lending library that touched on agriculture, which wasn't much, and a mail-order pamphlet from a university extension service that used words she had to look up. The pamphlet mentioned animal manure, not just any manure, so specific types, specific quantities, worked into the soil over time. It talked about nitrogen content and microbial activity and a dozen other things she didn't fully understand, but the essential message was clear. Certain kinds of animal waste, consistently applied, could rebuild exhausted soil over a period of 1 to 3 years. She read that pamphlet 3 times. Then she put it in the tin box with the money and spent the winter thinking. Ma, The news came to her by way of Eli Tanner in the second week of March. Eli was 14 years old and spent considerable energy trying to seem like he wasn't interested in Mara Holloway's farm, which meant he was over there at least twice a week doing odd jobs for whatever she could spare and asking questions about everything she was doing. He was a sharp-eyed boy with a gap between his front teeth and a habit of showing up precisely when something interesting was about to happen, which she'd come to suspect was not entirely coincidental. He came banging on her door on a Tuesday morning before she'd finished her coffee, which she'd made weak because the grounds were getting thin. "Miss Holloway, you hear about Cutler's place?" She had not. She poured him the last of the coffee without asking and pulled on her coat. Walt Cutler ran a small operation 3 miles east of town. Livestock mostly, some truck farming. He'd been raising rabbits for pelts and meat for the better part of a decade, but Walt had gotten an offer to relocate to his wife's family's land up north, and he was leaving within the month. The rabbits were the problem. He had 64 of them, various ages, various breeds, the accumulation of years of not quite knowing when to cull a herd. Nobody wanted them. The meat buyers in town would take maybe a dozen, and that was being generous. The rest were, in the language of practical frontier commerce, excess inventory heading toward a slaughter pen. Walt wanted $4 for the lot, just to have someone take them off his hands before he left. If no one took them by Friday, he was going to deal with it himself. Mara listened to all of this standing in her doorway with her coffee going cold. 64 rabbits, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And nobody's offered to take them." "Not for that price. Jeremiah Holt said he'd take 10 of the does if Walt would give them free, but Walt said no." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the kitchen smelled like weak coffee and the particular staleness of a house that had been closed up all winter. Through the window, she could see her south field, the one she'd been trying hardest to bring back, still gray and bare in the early March light. The pamphlet was in the tin box. 64 rabbits meant 64 consistent sources of manure, every day, all season, manageable quantities that she could work into the soil systematically. It meant fur, too. Not the rough pelts Walt had been selling, but if she could learn to process it properly, actually spin it. She'd read something about that, too, in a different pamphlet, one she'd borrowed from a woman in town who'd gotten it from relatives back east. $4. She had 31. "Eli," she said, "can you hitch Clover for me?" She drove out to Cutler's place alone because she didn't need anyone's opinion on what she was about to do, and she knew that bringing Eli would mean it got back to town before she was home for supper. Walt Cutler was a fair man and a tired one. He showed her the rabbits without trying to sell them to her, which she respected. They were in reasonable condition, not thriving, but not neglected either. Mixed ages, mixed breeds. A few she could identify from her reading, most she couldn't. Some of the older ones had the bony look of animals that had been kept too long without enough forage. But their eyes were clear and their coats were intact, and they were, without question, alive and headed for somewhere considerably less comfortable if she walked away. $4, Walt said. "That's what I'm asking." "I know," she said. "I'll take them all." He looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression of a man who wants to ask a question, but suspects the answer will just make him more confused. "You got hutches?" "I'll build them." "That's a lot of animals, Miss Holloway." "I know how many 64 is, Walt." He took her money. They shook hands. She drove back to her farm in the afternoon light with 64 rabbits in crates in the wagon bed, listening to them shift and settle and occasionally thump against the wood. And she thought about the fact that she had $27 left and a plan that she had not explained to a single person in Redstone Crossing because she already knew what they would say. The hutches took her 2 weeks to build and nearly all of her remaining lumber. She'd sketched the design herself based on drawings in the pamphlet, raised off the ground for drainage, wire-bottom sections so the manure dropped through, collection trays she fashioned from old tin she'd salvaged from her father's workshop. Eli helped without being asked, showing up on the third morning with a hammer and no explanation, and she put him to work without comment. "People are talking," he told her on the 5th day, driving nails into the frame of the second hutch row. "I assumed. Mrs. Calloway at the dry goods said you'd lost your mind. Said spending money on rabbits when you can barely make the mortgage was the kind of thing that happened when a person had been alone too long." Mrs. Calloway has 6 children and a husband who drinks her patience away and still thinks she knows better than everyone in the county. Eli processed this. Yes, ma'am. What should I say if people ask me about it? Tell them I'm working on something. Tell them to wait. They won't like that answer. No, she agreed. They won't. The hutches were finished on a Thursday. She moved the rabbits in over the course of that afternoon, and for the first time since they'd arrived, the animals seemed to settle, spreading out into the space, finding corners, arranging themselves with the particular purposefulness of creatures who had been crowded for too long. She stood at the entrance to the hutch row in the evening light and looked at all of them. 64 animals. $27 gone from her tin. Spring planning 4 weeks away. All right, she said quietly, to no one in particular, or maybe to all of them. The first visit from Gideon Mercer came in April, and it was not entirely unexpected. He rode out on a Tuesday morning, which was when he made his rounds, and he tied his horse at the post by her gate and walked the property the way he always did before coming to the house, hands clasped behind his back, examining everything with a lender's eye for what was there and what wasn't. She watched him from the kitchen window, noting the moment he registered the hutch rows, the way he stopped and counted them, and then stood still for a moment longer than was natural. When he knocked, she was already pouring coffee. Miss Holloway. Mr. Mercer, sit down. He sat. She put the coffee in front of him and waited. 64 rabbits, he said. Thereabouts. Lost one of the older ones last week. 63 now. I see. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He had large hands, she'd always noticed. The hands of someone who'd done physical work before he'd moved into finances. And what's your plan with them? She told him. Not all of it. She didn't owe him all of it, but enough. The manure amendment, the soil recovery timeline, the fur processing she was experimenting with. He listened without interruption, which was one of the things she actually respected about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The soil recovery is going to take time, he said. You won't see significant yield improvement this season. I know that. So you're betting your 3rd season on a plan that won't pay off until the 4th. I'm betting my 3rd season on a plan that builds toward the 4th. There's a difference. He looked at her with that fence post expression. And the rabbits. You think you can generate income from the fur? I think I can generate enough to cover the interest this year while the soil recovers. You think? I'm working on it. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down with a small, precise movement. Miss Holloway, I want to be direct with you. You always are. The terms of your loan require meaningful progress by the end of this calendar year. Meaningful progress means either reduced principal or demonstrated income capacity. Rabbits. He paused. Rabbits are not, in my experience, a path to meaningful progress. Your experience is also not my experience, she said. And I haven't asked you to co-sign my decisions, Mr. Mercer. I've asked you to hold the note I agreed to pay. He stood. He picked up his hat. At the door, he turned. I hope you know what you're doing, he said. I hope so too, she said honestly. Come back in August and see. The town's opinion was not subtle. By May, the consensus in Redstone Crossing was that Mara Holloway had finally cracked under the pressure of farming alone, and that the rabbits were the evidence. People weren't cruel about it, mostly. They were the particular kind of pitying that is sometimes worse than cruelty, the way a community looks at someone who has started making decisions that don't make sense to them. She heard it through Eli, who heard it everywhere. Tom Birch says you're going to eat through your savings and lose the homestead by fall, Eli reported one afternoon, stripping wire for the hutch repairs with the efficient movements of a boy who had decided this project was his business too. Tom Birch lost 2 horses to a bad purchase last year and still thinks he's an expert on livestock. He says rabbits can't replace a crop. He's right. They're not meant to replace a crop. They're meant to rebuild the soil that grows one. I understand that. I don't think he does. Then he doesn't have to. Eli worked in silence for a moment. He had this quality she'd noticed. He could be quiet without it being uncomfortable, which was rarer than people thought. Miss Holloway, he said after a while, what if it doesn't work? She didn't answer immediately. She was checking the wire on the 3rd hutch, where 2 of the young does had started showing signs of chewing at the frame, which meant they needed more forage variety. It's going to work, she said. But what if... Eli. She looked at him. I have thought about what happens if it doesn't work every single day since I paid Walt Cutler $4 for these animals. I have thought about it at 3 in the morning, and I have thought about it while I was working, and I have thought about it sitting right here. And at the end of all that thinking, I still believe this is the right path. So I need you to either believe it with me or keep the doubt to yourself, because I don't have enough room for both my doubts and yours. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now look at this wire and tell me where it's compromised. The manure went into the south field first, worked in by hand in the cool of early morning before the day got too warm to be comfortable about it. She developed a rhythm, cleaning the hutches in rotation, collecting what came through the wire floors, hauling it to the field on the old barrow her father had kept behind the barn, turning it into the soil with the broad fork until her shoulders ached. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of work that got told as a success story while it was happening. It was dirty and physical, and she came in from it every evening with the particular exhaustion that settles in the muscles rather than the mind, and she ate whatever she had and went to bed and got up and did it again. But she watched the south field. By June, something was different. She wasn't sure if she was imagining it. She'd been staring at that soil long enough to start seeing things she wanted to see, but the color had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not the way a field looks in a good year, rich and dark and promising. More like the color of soil that was remembering what it was supposed to be. She dug a test hole in the first week of July, and the smell of the earth was different, earthier, alive in a way it hadn't been. She went inside and she sat at her kitchen table and she pressed her hands flat against the wood, and she let herself feel something she'd been too cautious to feel since March. Maybe. But the fur work had been going slower. She'd gotten the basic processing down well enough, washing and combing the molted fur from the Angora crosses Walt had in the mix, learning to keep it clean enough to be workable. The spinning was harder. She'd learned to spin as a girl, the way most girls in frontier communities did, but spinning rabbit fur was different from wool, lighter and more slippery, and her first attempts had produced yarn that fell apart in her hands. She went to see Dorothy Crane. Dorothy was 60 years old and had lived in Redstone Crossing longer than most of the buildings, and she had opinions about everything and shared them whether asked or not, which meant that asking her for advice meant submitting to a full assessment of your life choices. Mara had been avoiding it. She knocked on Dorothy's door on a Wednesday afternoon. Well, Dorothy said, opening the door, the rabbit woman. I need to know how to spin fur yarn that doesn't fall apart. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. Bring whatever you're working with. They sat at Dorothy's kitchen table for 3 hours. Dorothy was exacting and not particularly gentle about pointing out mistakes, but she knew what she was doing, and by the time Mara left, she had a skein of yarn in her hands that held together, that had actual texture and resilience to it, that felt, when she ran it through her fingers, like something that might genuinely be worth something. That'll keep a person warm, Dorothy said at the door. That's what I'm counting on, Mara said. What are you going to make with it? Gloves first, maybe blankets if I can produce enough. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The fur is warm, she said, and her voice had shifted. Less the instructor, more just a woman noticing something. Warmer than I expected. I know, Mara said. She started the gloves in August. She had no pattern, so she made one. She had a rough idea of scale from the mitten she'd made for herself as a girl, and she adapted it, working and unworking sections until the proportions were right. The first pair was lopsided. The second pair was better. By the fifth pair, she had something she was willing to show another person. She brought a pair to Dorothy. Dorothy put them on and stood at her kitchen window for a long moment. How much would you sell these for? She asked. Mara named a price. Dorothy named a higher one. You think someone would pay that? Mara said. Someone would pay more than that, Dorothy said, turning her gloved hands in the light. These aren't like wool gloves, Mara. They're something else. Warmer? Warmer and lighter. The weight isn't there. She took them off carefully, with the attention of someone handling something she intended to keep. Where did you learn to spin it this well? From you, mostly, and from failing at it about 40 times. Dorothy laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. Well, you'd better make more. Oh, by late August, the South Field had changed in a way that was no longer subtle. She'd planted a late cover crop there in June, the kind that grows fast and dies back and adds organic matter when you turn it under, and it had come in thicker than anything she'd grown in 3 years. The adjacent plot she hadn't treated showed the familiar thin, pale growth of depleted soil. The south field looked like a different county. Eli stood at the edge of it one afternoon, hands in his pockets, looking at it with the expression of someone recalibrating something. "That's real," he said. "I know it's real. It's actually Eli. Yeah, say it." He looked at her sideways. "You were right." She let that sit for a moment. She didn't rub it in, though she wanted to. She had enough dignity for that. "One field," she said. "We've got 2 more to treat this fall and through the winter. If everything holds, it'll hold." "You sound confident." "I'm confident in the rabbits," he said, and glanced back at the hutches, where 63 animals were going about their small, purposeful lives. "They're reliable. More reliable than—" He stopped. "Than people?" she offered. "I was going to say than weather," he said, but he was smiling when he said it. "What?" Gideon Mercer came back in August, as she'd invited him to. She walked him to the south field first, before coffee, before any conversation. She let the field speak for itself. He walked the edge of it without saying anything, and then he walked the middle of it, and he crouched down and touched the soil with 2 fingers the way farmers do, not bankers, and she thought there might be something in that gesture that she hadn't expected from him. He stood back up. He looked at the hutches. "The manure," he said. "Yes." "All of this is from the manure." "And the cover crop rotation." "Yes." He looked at the field for another long moment. "It's real," he said. "I know it is. I didn't think—" He stopped. He was not a man who liked leaving sentences unfinished, she suspected, but he left that one there. Back in the kitchen, she showed him the gloves. He held one in his large hands and turned it over. "You're selling these?" "I've sold 11 pairs. I have orders for 6 more." "At what price?" She told him. He set the glove down. "Miss Holloway," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology." "I don't need one." "Nevertheless." She poured his coffee. "I'm still behind on the note," she said. "Let's not pretend the field changes the math on what's owed." "No, but it changes how I read the risk." "Good," she said. "Read it clearly then. I'm going to make it. It's going to take time. But the rabbits are working and the soil is coming back and the gloves are selling. I need the winter to prove the rest." He picked up his coffee. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from how he'd looked at her in April. Not with doubt, exactly, but with the expression of a person who has revised their estimate of something significantly upward. "I'll need to see the numbers by December," he said. "You'll have them." He nodded. And for the first time since she'd signed those papers in his office, she almost believed him when he did. The fall came in golden and then cold in the way the frontier falls did. Beautiful and then brutal without much transition. She worked the manure into the east and north fields through September and October, laying the groundwork for next year's recovery, storing the processed fur, spinning evenings by lamplight when the days grew short. Eli helped until his own family's harvest demanded him, and then she worked alone the way she'd worked before he showed up, with the quiet efficiency of someone who has too much to do to spend time feeling lonely about it. She was not lonely, exactly. She was tired and sometimes scared, and occasionally, at 3 in the morning, she would lie in the dark and run the numbers and feel the cold weight of what was at stake. But loneliness was a different thing. She had the rabbits, which were not company in any human sense, but were alive and present and demanding in ways that kept her moving through the days when moving was hard. She had Eli's intermittent appearances. She had Dorothy, who had started coming by on Sundays, unofficially, in the way that frontier women sometimes created the patterns of friendship without ever naming them as such. She had her work. And as October turned to November, with 40 pairs of gloves sold, and 2 rough blankets she was proud of, and a south field that had produced a late-season greens crop that she'd sold at the market for real money, she had something else. Evidence. Not victory, not safety. Not the solved equation that Gideon Mercer needed from her by December, but evidence that she had been right about the rabbits, about the soil, about the possibility of the things she'd bet everything on in the mud outside Walt Cutler's pen back in March. She stood at the edge of the south field one evening in early November in the last light, with the cold coming down off the ridge in a way that bit through her coat, and she looked at what she had built. 63 rabbits behind her, warm in their hutches. A field in front of her that had come back from what she'd thought was the dead. $37 in the tin box, more than she'd started the year with for the first time in 3 years. And a winter ahead that she didn't know yet was going to be the worst in decades, that was going to test everything she'd built with a particular viciousness, that was going to bring her to the edge of losing all of it, and then, in ways she couldn't have predicted, show her something about what she'd actually been building. But she didn't know that yet. She just stood there in the cold light with the evidence of her own stubbornness spread out in front of her, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Ready. The first real snow came on a Wednesday in mid-November, and it came without much warning. Mara had been watching the sky since Monday, the particular flat gray that settled over the ridge when weather was building. But the county had seen gray skies all fall that produced nothing more than cold rain, and she had started to discount her own instincts about it. She was in the middle of turning manure into the north field when the flakes started, small and dry and sideways in the wind, and by the time she got the barrow back to the barn and the rabbits checked and the water lines wrapped with the old burlap she'd been saving, there were 2 inches on the ground and the light was dropping fast. It wasn't the worst snow she'd seen. It wasn't even close to what was coming later. But it was the first sign of the season that would eventually take everything she'd built and put it on the edge of a cliff and see what happened when she looked down. She didn't know that yet. She just did what needed doing and went inside. Dorothy Crane showed up on the following Sunday with a sack of dried apples and an expression that meant she had something to say and had been working up to it. Mara poured coffee and waited. "People are noticing," Dorothy said. "Noticing what?" "The gloves. Margaret Holst wore hers to the feed store last week, and Frank Holst couldn't stop asking where they came from, and Clara Webb has been wearing that small blanket of yours around the house." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "People are talking differently now." "Differently than what?" "Than they were in March." Dorothy gave her a look. "You know what they were saying in March?" "I know what Eli reported." "It was worse than what Eli reported. He softened it for you." She drank her coffee. "The point is, they're not saying that anymore. Or at least not all of them. Some of them are still saying it. Tom Birch and a few others. But Frank Holst came around. And the Webbs. And I think Jeremiah Holt is reconsidering." Mara was quiet for a moment. She was at the window, watching the south field under its thin layer of snow. And she was thinking about the spring planting, about what the soil would be ready for, about whether she could get the east field to the same condition before April. "It doesn't matter who's reconsidering," she said. "What matters is the December numbers for Mercer." "How close are you?" She'd been running the calculations all week. The glove sales had brought in more than she'd projected, but she'd also had an unexpected cost. One of the older bucks had gotten sick in October, and she'd spent 2 days nursing him and lost him anyway. And replacing him had cost her more than she wanted to admit. The blanket sales were slower, partly because she'd only finished 2, and partly because she didn't know yet how to price them properly. "Not close enough," she said. "If I sell everything I have in progress before the end of December and the weather holds for market days, I might make interest, not principal. And Mercer needs principal. Mercer needs demonstrated progress. That's what he said. I don't know exactly what that means to him." Dorothy was quiet. She had the quality of someone who understood the difference between helpful advice and noise, and she mostly chose silence when she didn't have the former. "Make more gloves," she finally said. "I'm already making them every evening." "Make them faster." "Dorothy." I know that's not useful." She set down her cup. "What if you had help? With the spinning, not the construction. I can spin faster than you can. So can Nellie Tanner, Eli's mother. So can 2 or 3 other women in town if you ask them." Mara turned from the window. "I'm not asking for charity." "It's not charity. You'd pay them from the sales. A fair cut." Dorothy met her eyes. "Mara, you built the operation alone. That doesn't mean you have to run it alone." She stood with that for a moment longer than was comfortable. There was something in her, the same quality that had kept her on that land through 3 bad seasons, that resisted this. Asking for help felt too close to admitting she couldn't do it alone, and admitting that felt like giving ground to everyone who'd been waiting for her to do exactly that. Let me think about it, she said. Think fast, Dorothy said. December is 6 weeks away. Chad. She went to see Nellie Tanner on a Thursday, which took more out of her than she wanted to admit. Nellie was a plain-spoken woman in her late 30s who ran a tight household and had opinions she didn't keep to herself, and she had been among the voices in town that spring who had questioned the wisdom of spending frontier money on unwanted rabbits. Mara knew this from Eli, who had told her with the particular discomfort of a boy reporting something he wished he hadn't heard. She knocked on the Tanner door with 2 pairs of gloves in her coat pocket, and the knowledge that Eli was probably at school and wouldn't be around to make this more awkward. Nellie opened the door. There was a beat. The kind that happens between 2 women who have been at cross purposes without ever having a direct conversation about it. Miss Holloway? Nellie said. Mrs. Tanner. She took out the gloves. Can I show you something? Nellie looked at the gloves. She looked at Mara. She opened the door wider. The kitchen was warm and smelled like bread. Nellie put on one of the gloves at the table and didn't say anything for a moment, just moved her fingers inside it, feeling the weight and structure of it. Eli made these? She asked. Eli helped with the hutches and the cleaning and more than I can list, but no, the spinning and knitting are mine. From the rabbit fur. The Angora crosses mostly. There are 8 of them in the mix. The fur is exceptional for fiber once you learn how to handle it. Nellie took the glove off and turned it inside out, looking at the construction. This was the look of someone who actually knew what they were examining, and Mara revised her estimate of the conversation. It's warm, Nellie said, more so than wool at the same weight. And you're selling them. I've sold 51 pairs. I have orders I can't fill fast enough. Nellie set the glove on the table. And you want help? I want to pay someone who knows what they're doing to spin the fiber. I can't knit fast enough to keep up with what I can spin, and I can't spin fast enough to keep up with the fiber the rabbits produce. She kept her voice level. Dorothy Crane said you were skilled at spinning. Dorothy Crane talks too much. She's usually right, though. Nellie almost smiled at that. Almost. What's the arrangement? She asked. Mara laid it out. A fair wage paid weekly from sales with a clear accounting of what came in and what went out. No handshake deals, nothing informal. She'd write it up if Nellie wanted it written, because she'd learned from her father that verbal arrangements between neighbors had a way of becoming complicated when the seasons changed. Nellie listened without interrupting. Can I see the operation? She asked when Mara finished. The rabbits. What you've built. Come on Saturday, Mara said. Bring Eli if he wants to come. Eli's been coming whether I wanted him to or not, Nellie said, and this time she did smile. It changed her face considerably. He talks about those rabbits like they're something to be proud of. He helped build it. He should be proud of it. Something shifted in Nellie's expression, some small internal recalibration that Mara saw but didn't comment on. Saturday, Nellie said. Mom. Nellie came on Saturday with 2 other women Mara hadn't expected. Clara Webb, and a quiet woman named Ruth Alderman, who had moved to the county 2 years ago and whom Mara had spoken to exactly once at the market. They stood in a row at the hutch entrance and looked at 63 rabbits with the focused attention of people who were evaluating something, not just observing it. Mara showed them the fiber processing, she showed them the yarn she'd produced, and the difference between what she'd made in the first weeks and what she was making now. She showed them the gloves and the 2 finished blankets. Clara Webb picked up the larger blanket and held it. My daughter has been sleeping under this since I bought it, she said. She's been sleeping better than she has in 2 years. The fur traps air differently than wool does, Mara said. It insulates without the weight. I know what it does, Clara said quietly. I just didn't know you'd made it. The women were quiet for a moment, in the way that groups are quiet when something unspoken is being renegotiated between them. Ruth Alderman hadn't said anything yet. She was still at the hutch entrance, watching a pair of the young Angora crosses groom each other with the methodical attention of animals who had nothing more pressing to do. I used to keep Angoras back in Pennsylvania, she said, without turning around, before we came west. Do you know how to process the fiber? Better than most. She turned. She had a direct way of looking at a person that Mara recognized as the look of someone else who had been underestimated enough times to stop caring what people thought of her gaze. I stopped because we couldn't afford to keep animals that weren't producing meat or work. These produce both, Mara said. Meat if needed, but the fur is where the value is if you handle it right. Ruth looked at the hutch row again, at the rabbits, at the field beyond, the south field, its improvement visible even under the thin snow. You did that with the manure, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Started in March. It takes time. I know it takes time. She pulled her coat tighter. What do you need? By the first week of December, there were 4 women spinning fiber at their own kitchen tables in Redstone Crossing, and Mara was knitting gloves in every free hour she had. The arrangement was exactly what she'd told Nellie. Clear accounting, fair pay, written up on paper that everyone signed. Eli ran the fiber between the homestead and town twice a week on his way to and from school, which he'd offered to do and which saved her 2 hours she badly needed. The glove orders were coming in faster than she'd expected. Part of it was word of mouth. Clara Webb talking to her neighbors, Ruth Alderman mentioning it to the families she knew from the Eastern Settlement, Dorothy Crane telling approximately everyone she encountered whether they'd asked or not. Part of it was the cold itself, which had settled into the county with a persistence that was starting to feel less like November weather and more like something heavier. The men at the feedlot were talking about the winter predictions. Old Walt Birch, Tom's father, a man who had lived in the county for 50 years and tracked weather with the attention of someone who had learned to respect it, was saying it was going to be bad. The kind of bad that only came along once every generation or so. The kind that killed livestock that weren't properly sheltered and froze pipes, and in the worst cases, killed people who underestimated it. Mara listened to these reports through Eli, who had a gift for extracting information from adults who didn't realize they were being interviewed. She checked her rabbit hutches every evening and reinforced the insulation in the walls and made sure the water systems were as protected as she could make them. She wasn't certain about the winter forecast, but she believed Walt Birch over most weather predictions, and she prepared accordingly. What she couldn't prepare for, what nobody could have fully prepared for, was Gideon Mercer. But he came on a Tuesday in the second week of December, and his expression when she opened the door was different from the August visit. Less evaluating, more decided. She knew the difference. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "come in." "I won't take long," he said, which she knew was a bad sign. People who had good news took their time with it. He stood in her kitchen without sitting, which was another bad sign, and he put a folded document on the table. "The Regional Lending Office has been reviewing extended accounts," he said. "Accounts that have been carried more than 3 years without full repayment progress. Yours is among them." She looked at the document without touching it. "You told me you needed to see the December numbers." "I do. And I'm looking at what I have, which is a note that is significantly in arrears and an operation that is promising but has not yet demonstrated the income capacity to service the debt at the level required." "Promising," she said. "That's the word you're using. Mara." He said her name for the first time, and she wasn't sure if that was meant to be personal or professional and decided it didn't matter. "The lending office is requiring a payment schedule review. I've been authorized to tell you that if you cannot demonstrate capacity for full repayment within 60 days, the note will be called." The room was quiet. Outside, the wind was picking up, and she could hear it against the kitchen window. 60 days, she said. "Yes." "That's February." "Yes." "It's December. The ground is frozen. The market is slow. I'm producing gloves as fast as 4 people can spin, and I can knit, and you're telling me I need to demonstrate full repayment capacity by February." "I'm telling you what the lending office has directed." "Are you telling me what they directed, or are you telling me what you decided to direct to me after they gave you latitude on how to handle extended accounts?" He was quiet for a moment, which told her something. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. She worked to keep it that way. "I have rebuilt that south field from dead ground into the most productive soil on this side of the county. I have created a product that people are buying because it keeps their families warm. I have done this in less than a year from a standing start with animals everybody told me were worthless. And you're standing in my kitchen telling me that isn't enough. I'm telling you that the debt is real and the deadline is real. And I'm telling you that calling this note in February will destroy something that benefits this entire community, not just me." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. It felt too much like pleading. She picked the document up off the table and looked at it. The numbers were exactly as bad as she'd thought. I need more time. I know you do. Can you give it to me? He picked up his hat. He was at the door before he answered. Come to the office before Christmas, he said. Bring your accounts, all of them. He paused. I'm not indifferent to what you've built, Miss Holloway, but I'm not a charitable institution. I've never asked you to be. No, he agreed. You haven't. He opened the door and the cold came through it. Before Christmas, he said, and then he was gone. She stood in her kitchen for a while after he left. She didn't cry. She was past the age and the circumstances that made crying feel useful, but she stood at the window and she looked at the south field under the December sky, and she felt the particular weight of a problem that doesn't have a clean solution. The numbers were the numbers. She'd run them every way she could. If she sold every pair of gloves she could produce between now and February, if the weather allowed market days, if nothing went wrong with the rabbits or the equipment or the spinning arrangement, she might get close enough to partial repayment to make an argument for extension. But close enough wasn't certain, and certain was what she needed. Eli found her there when he came by after school, which he still did twice a week, even in December, even when she hadn't asked him to. He read her face when she opened the door. What happened? He asked. Mercer came. He came inside without being invited and sat at the table the way he'd been doing for months, the way that had stopped feeling like an imposition and started feeling just like what happened on Tuesdays. She told him. All of it. The 60-day notice, the numbers, the gap between what she had and what she needed. He was quiet through all of it. He had the unusual quality for a 14-year-old of not filling silence with noise. Could you sell the blankets faster? He asked when she finished. I've only got 2 finished and 2 in progress. They take twice the time and fiber of 6 pairs of gloves, and the profit margin isn't proportionally higher. What if they were bigger? Big enough for a family? She looked at him. I mean, people are talking about the cold this winter. Walt Birch is saying it could be the worst in 30 years. If it is, a family blanket is worth more than 6 pairs of gloves. He picked at a knot in the table wood, which was a habit she'd noticed when he was thinking. What if you made one really big one? As a demonstration, showed what it could do. Who would buy a family-sized blanket in the middle of December when I need cash now? Maybe nobody buys it, he said slowly. Maybe it just shows what's possible, so that when the cold really comes, he stopped. He'd gotten ahead of his own reasoning and hit the limit of it, but she was still looking at him, because he'd touched something. Not the specific idea, but the edge of something. When the cold really comes, she'd been thinking about her problem as a money problem, a debt problem, a time problem. She'd been thinking about it the way Gideon Mercer thought about it, in numbers, in deadlines, in the cold arithmetic of what was owed. But the cold was coming. Walt Birch said it was going to be bad, the kind of bad that only came once in a generation. And she had 63 rabbits producing the warmest fiber this side of the territory, and 4 women spinning it, and orders she couldn't fill fast enough. If the cold came the way Walt Birch said it would, she pushed that thought away. She couldn't plan around a disaster. That was the kind of thinking that led people into bad decisions. But she couldn't quite push it all the way out of her mind. Go home, she told Eli. It's getting dark and your mother will worry. She doesn't worry about me. She tells herself that so she can sleep. Go. He went, pulling his coat on at the door. The coat she'd noticed was thin at the elbows in a way that wasn't quite shabby, but was heading there. She looked at the coat as he left. Then she went to her knitting basket, and she looked at the half-finished gloves inside it, and then at the pile of spun yarn, and then at the window and the December sky beyond it. She worked until the lamp oil was too low to justify continuing, and when she finally went to bed, she lay in the dark and thought about warmth, about what it was worth when you didn't have it, about 63 rabbits in their hutches, alive and unbothered by the cold because she'd insulated their walls, because she'd thought ahead, because that was the kind of person she was, even when nobody gave her credit for it, about what was coming. She didn't sleep well. But she got up before dawn anyway, the way she always did, because the rabbits needed tending and the work didn't stop for bad nights. And she went out into the dark cold of the December morning, and she did what needed doing. That was the kind of person she was. It had cost her a great deal. She was starting to understand slowly that it might also be the thing that saved her. Walt Birch had been right about the cold, and he hadn't been right enough. The storm came on the 19th of December, which was a Thursday, and it came in a way that the county hadn't seen in living memory, not as a gradual worsening the way most winter storms built, but as a wall. 1 hour, there was gray sky and the kind of cold that was uncomfortable but manageable. And the next hour, there was a whiteout so complete that Mara couldn't see the hutch row from her back door. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, and the wind took the feeling from her face, and she went back inside and put on everything she owned and went out again because the rabbits needed water, and the water lines needed checking, and standing in her kitchen was not going to help any of that. The cold was something different from what she'd prepared for. She'd insulated the hutch walls with extra hay bales through November and wrapped the water lines twice over and made sure the collection trays had clearance, and all of that preparation was the only reason she didn't lose animals that first night. She lost one anyway. A smaller doe near the end of the second row, one of the older ones, who had been thin since October no matter what Mara fed her. She found her in the morning, curled small and still in the corner of her space, and she stood there with the cold eating through her coat and felt the particular guilt of someone who had done everything right and still come up short. 62 rabbits now. She didn't have time to grieve it properly. She had water to break ice out of, and animals to feed, and her own extremities to keep from becoming a problem. And she did all of it in the gray morning light of a storm that showed no sign of lessening. The county was not moving. By the second day, she could see this from the ridge above her property. No tracks on the main road, no smoke from the tanner place that she could usually spot through the tree line, nothing moving in the white world outside her fence. The snow was past her knee in the open and above her hip in the places where it had drifted against the barn and the hutch row. The temperature had dropped to something she didn't have an accurate instrument to measure, but that she knew from the way the moisture in her breath froze before it fully left her face. She couldn't get to town. She couldn't get anywhere. What she could do was work. She had a full 3 weeks of fiber stored in the barn, processed and ready, 2 garbage sacks full of spun yarn that Nellie and Ruth and the others had delivered before the storm, and her own spinning she'd done through December. She had her knitting needles and a lamp and enough oil to last, if she was careful, another 10 days. She had food enough for herself, dried beans and preserves and the last of the root vegetables from her small kitchen garden. She had the rabbits, which were expensive to feed through a storm, but which she fed anyway because they were the reason she was still in business, and because she was not the kind of person who let something in her care die to save money. She knitted. She knitted by lamplight in the evenings, and in the gray storm light through the windows during the day, and she thought about what Eli had said the week before, about the cold that was coming, about what warmth was worth when you didn't have it. And she knitted faster than she had ever knitted in her life, working the rabbit fur yarn with the focused intensity of someone who had figured out that this was the only productive thing she could do while the world outside was shut down. She was on her 14th pair of gloves when the knock came at her door on the 3rd evening. It was Frank Holst. He was covered from head to boot in snow, and he was breathing in the shallow, rapid way of a man who had walked farther than was sensible in weather that was worse than sensible, and he stood on her porch with an expression that she read immediately as a bad news. "Frank," she said, "get inside." He came in and she gave him the last of her coffee, and he wrapped his hands around the cup and didn't say anything for a moment while the warmth worked its way back into him. "My youngest," he said finally. "Sarah. She's been sick since Tuesday. Fever and chills. Margaret's been keeping her warm as she can, but the stove's been struggling to keep up in this cold," and he stopped. His voice had done something at the edges that he was working to control. "Margaret sent me to ask if you had any of those blankets left." She looked at him. Frank Holst was not a man who asked for help. He was not the man who had said the cruelest things about her rabbits in the spring. That was Tom Birch and a few others. But he had not been among her defenders either, and she knew that coming here through a blizzard, to her door, to ask for something from the woman his town had spent the better part of a year doubting, cost him something that the cold alone couldn't account for. "I have one finished blanket," she said, "and one that's 2/3 done. I'll take whatever you can give me." She went to the bedroom and got the finished one, the larger of the 2 she had, the one she'd been saving for a sale that could make a real dent in her debt. She brought it out and handed it to him, and he took it with the careful hands of a man holding something his daughter needed. "What do I owe you?" he asked. "Nothing tonight," she said. "Pay me when the storm breaks." He looked at her with an expression she didn't entirely know how to read. It was complicated in the way that a person's face gets complicated when they've been wrong about something and they know it, and they haven't yet found the words for what comes after being wrong. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Frank, get that blanket home to Sarah." He nodded. He went. She stood at the closed door for a moment, and then she went back to her chair and her knitting, and she finished the second blanket before she slept. The storm didn't break. It deepened. By the fifth day, the drifts against the north side of the barn were level with the eaves, and she had to dig a trench each morning to reach the hutch row, scooping and packing the snow with a system she'd developed because the alternative was letting the path close over and losing access to the animals. Her shoulders burned from it. Her hands, even inside her own rabbit fur gloves, were taking longer each morning to regain full feeling. She was on her way back from the hutches on the sixth morning when she saw a figure coming through the snow from the direction of the Tanner place. It was Eli. He was dressed in more layers than she'd ever seen him wear, and he was moving with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating terrain that wanted to swallow them. And when he got to her fence line, she went out to meet him, because the drifts were bad on his side, and she knew the path better than he did. "What are you doing?" she said when she reached him. "Coming to help." He was breathing hard. His face was red with cold in a way that was at the edge of concerning. "You walked through this. It's only half a mile. In this, half a mile." She stopped arguing because arguing in a blizzard was inefficient. "Get inside." She made him stand by the stove until the color in his face returned to something normal, and she made him eat the last of the dried apple she had, which she'd been rationing because he'd burned something walking that distance in that cold, and she wasn't going to let him fall over in her kitchen. "Your mother know you're here?" she asked. "She knows I left." "That's not what I asked." "She worries," he said, which was an admission from a boy who 3 months ago had insisted she didn't. "But we're okay. The stove is good, and we've got food." He looked at her knitting basket. "How many pairs have you made?" 18 since the storm started." He stared at her. "I couldn't go anywhere," she said. "What else was I going to do?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle she hadn't noticed him carrying, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with twine. "Mama sent this. Spun yesterday and the day before." He set it on the table. "She's been spinning every evening. She said to tell you she's sorry it's not more." Mara looked at the bundle. She looked at Eli. Something moved through her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. "Tell her it's plenty," she said. "Tell her it's—" She stopped. "Tell her thank you." Eli nodded. "The aldermans lost their chimney pipe in the first night," he said. "It pulled loose and the snow collapsed part of it. They've been at the Holsts since." "How are the Holsts?" "Sarah's better. Frank came by our place yesterday and said the blanket made the difference. She broke the fever." He paused. "He said some other things, too." "About me?" "About the rabbits." He picked at the table knot. "He said he'd been a fool." "He wasn't a fool," she said. "He just didn't have enough information." "He said that, too. He used different words." She almost smiled at that. "How's the county doing overall, do you know?" He'd gathered information the way he always did from whatever sources presented themselves. The picture he assembled was not good. The eastern settlement had 3 families who'd lost significant livestock. A whole herd of sheep belonging to the Garner family, frozen in a barn that hadn't been properly sealed. The road crew that maintained the main track through town had been unable to work since the first day. 2 elderly residents who lived alone were being checked on by neighbors who were themselves struggling through the snow to do so. And across all of it, running through every account Eli had collected, was the cold. The persistent abnormal cold that wasn't letting up, that was finding every gap in every structure, that was turning what should have been a hard winter into something that people were running out of resources to manage. "Eli," she said quietly. "Yeah." "The gloves I've made since the storm started. Did you bring your sled?" "I dragged it part way but left it at the fence." "Get it. We're going to load it." He looked at her. "Load it with what?" "Gloves," she said. 18 pairs. And the bundle of yarn your mother sent. We'll keep that. But the gloves go out today." "Where?" "Wherever they're needed." She was already on her feet, moving to where she'd stacked the finished pairs in the bedroom, wrapped in cloth to keep them clean. "The aldermans at the Holst's place, the elderly residents you mentioned. Anyone Eli Tanner thinks needs warm hands more than I need the sale price right now." He was very still for a moment. "Miss Holloway," he said slowly, "that's your December money." "I know what it is." "Mercer, I know." She kept moving. She stacked the gloves on the kitchen table and started sorting them by size the way she'd gotten into the habit of doing, though right now size was less important than having them and getting them where they were going before another day of frostbite did permanent damage to someone's hands. "Eli, there are people who need these today, not in the spring when the market reopens, not when I can get to town to sell them properly. Today. But you'll lose. What I'll lose is a chance to pay Gideon Mercer faster," she said. "What those families will lose if their hands freeze badly enough is their ability to work their land in the spring. Which is worse?" He thought about that. "That's not really a question," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They went out together into the blizzard, Eli pulling the sled and Mara navigating with the methodical care of someone who had been walking this county for 3 years and knew where the hidden drops were under the snow and where the wind would push you sideways if you let it. She carried extra gloves inside her coat, against her body, keeping them from the wet. It took 4 hours and covered less than 2 miles. They went to the Holsts first, where the aldermans were staying, and the alderman children, 3 of them, ranging from 6 to 11, had hands that were chapped and raw from days of inadequate covering. Mara put gloves on each of them herself, sizing by feel, adjusting the fingers, and the youngest girl held her gloved hands up and looked at them with an expression of pure animal relief that Mara felt somewhere specific and undefended in her chest. Ruth Alderman stood watching this. "What do I owe you?" she asked. Mara waved it off. "Mara." Ruth said it the way Dorothy did, not as a request, as a statement of intent. "I will pay you." "Pay me in the spring," Mara said, "when this is over and we can all breathe again." Ruth nodded. She looked at the gloves on her youngest daughter's hands. "I've been spinning every hour I had," she said quietly, "since the storm. I have 3 sacks. I didn't know how to get them to you. When the path's clear, send them with anyone coming my direction." "I will." She paused. "There are families on the East Road who don't have what they need. The Garners lost their sheep. They had blankets from the wool, but they're wet now from a leak in the roof, and they don't have anything to replace them with." Mara thought about the second blanket, the one she'd finished at 3 a.m. the night Frank Holst had come to her door. She had it on her bed because she'd needed to test it. She told herself she'd needed to test it. "I'll get to the Garners," she said. She got to the Garners on the second trip, which she made alone because she sent Eli home before his mother's worry became something worse than inconvenience. The Garner place was farther than she usually went on foot, but the alternative was knowing that a family was sleeping under wet blankets in a winter that was killing livestock in sealed barns, and she couldn't arrive at that alternative without her feet already moving. Pete Garner opened the door and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been humbled by weather past the point of pride. "Miss Holloway," he said. His voice was rough from cold or from something else she didn't investigate. "I brought something," she said. His wife Donna was at the table, mending by the stove, and she stood when Mara came in. The children, 2 boys, were in the corner wrapped in the wet blankets she'd heard about, playing a game with pebbles and not quite looking up. Mara put the blanket on the table. Donna Garner touched it, just touched it, with 2 fingers, the way Nellie Tanner had touched the glove in her kitchen 2 months ago, with the focused attention of someone evaluating something they needed to trust. "It's from the rabbits," Donna said. "Yes." "People said you were—" She stopped. "I know what people said," Mara said, not unkindly. "It doesn't matter now." "No," Donna agreed. "I suppose it doesn't." Pete Garner picked up the blanket and walked it over to his boys and spread it over them, and the older one, maybe 9 years old, pushed his hands under the edge of it and his whole face changed, that fast, that completely. Pete turned around and his face was doing something he was working to control, the way Frank Holst's face had done at her door. "What do you need for it?" he asked. "Pay me in the spring," she said. "When the soil thaws, I need someone to help me haul manure amendment to the east field. Your boys are big enough, 2 days' work from either one of them." He stared at her. 2 days' work. "That's fair," she said. "For me. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who is revising an estimate so significantly that the revision itself is uncomfortable. 2 days, he said, and then some. Shut. She was back at her homestead before dark, barely, the cold having found every gap in her coat by the time she got through her own gate. She stood in the hutch row for a while, checking the animals, counting them from habit. 62 still, no change. And then she went inside and she sat at her kitchen table in the lamplight and she looked at what she had left. 12 pairs of gloves, a bundle of yarn, the tin box under the floorboards with a number in it that was not enough for Gideon Mercer. She had given away 6 pairs today. In money terms, she had given away what those gloves would have sold for, which was not nothing. She was not pretending it was nothing. But she sat there and thought about Pete Garner's boy pushing his hands under that blanket, and she couldn't find regret in it. She looked for it honestly, because she was not sentimental about survival. She'd learned that much from 3 years on this ground. And there was no regret there. What there was, instead, was a question she hadn't been asking. She'd been thinking about her operation as a money problem from the moment Mercer had put that document on her table. Income, debt, deadline, gap, the arithmetic of survival. And all of that was real. The deadline was real. The debt was real. The numbers were what they were. But she had been thinking about what she'd built in the wrong terms. She'd built something that kept people warm. Not warm in the abstract, not warm as a byproduct of a financial venture. Warm in the specific and immediate sense that a child in a wet blanket was cold and now was not. Warm in the way that mattered when the temperature dropped to the level that killed things. She had 62 rabbits producing that warmth. 4 women spinning it. 18 pairs of gloves made in 6 days, storm-bound and alone. A field that had come back from dead soil because she'd been willing to do something ridiculous. What she hadn't done, she realized, was let any of that be visible in the right way. She'd been so focused on proving herself to Mercer, to the town's judgment, to the numbers in the tin box, that she'd kept her head down and her work close and her results quiet. The storm was making it visible. Not the way she'd have chosen, not in a way that helped her December deadline at all, but visible. She picked up her knitting needles. She had 12 pairs of gloves to sell, and a debt she couldn't pay, and a blizzard that was showing no signs of stopping, and Gideon Mercer was somewhere in town in a warm office that she could not currently reach, and the deadline was not moving. She thought about what Eli had said, about what warmth was worth when you didn't have it. She knitted. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows with the flat persistence of something that didn't care what it was interrupting, and the lamplight held against it, and the rabbits were warm in their hutch because she'd planned ahead, because that was the kind of person she was. And she worked until her fingers ached, and then she worked some more. The worst part of the night was around 2 in the morning, when the cold outside was at its deepest, and the lamp oil was getting low, and she let herself sit still for a moment, and the full weight of it came down on her. The deadline, the debt, the gap between what she had and what she needed, the knowledge that she'd just given away part of her December money because she couldn't look at Pete Garner's boys in wet blankets and walk away. She sat with the weight of it. She didn't have an answer for it. She just sat with it. The way you sometimes have to sit with the things that don't have clean answers, in the dark and the cold, and she didn't fall apart, and she didn't find a solution, and she didn't feel better when she finally went to bed. She just got up in the morning. She always just got up in the morning. And on the 8th day of the storm, when the snow finally slowed to something that wasn't a whiteout anymore, and she could see the tree line again, she pulled on her coat and went out to the hutches and counted 62 rabbits, and knew she had to go see Gideon Mercer and tell him she couldn't meet his deadline. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to explain herself in terms that sounded like excuses. She was going to go into that office and tell him the truth about where she was and what she'd done during the storm, and let him decide what he decided. Whatever he decided, she would live with it. She had always lived with it. She started down the road toward town, through the snow, alone, the way she'd done everything that mattered since her parents died. And she didn't know yet that the road into Redstone Crossing was not as empty as it looked, that behind her and ahead of her, invisible through the tree lines and across the county, something had shifted while the storm raged. She didn't know what she was walking toward. She just walked. The road into Redstone Crossing was not empty. She realized this gradually, the way you realize things when you're tired and cold and moving through snow that's still shin-deep in the packed sections and knee-deep where it drifted. Not all at once, but in pieces. A set of tracks ahead of her that hadn't been there before the storm. then another set coming from the Tanner direction. Then, when she crested the small rise above the creek crossing, she could see the main road into town, and there were figures on it. Not just one or two, several. Moving in the same direction she was moving. She stopped at the crest and looked. She recognized Frank Holst's build, the wide shoulders and the particular forward lean of a man who'd spent decades working into wind. She recognized Pete Garner's wagon, though it was moving slowly through the snow, his older horse picking its way carefully. She thought the figure ahead of Pete was Dorothy Crane, though at that distance in the flat winter light, she couldn't be certain. They were all going toward town. She stood there for a moment, not understanding what she was looking at. Then she started walking again, because standing still was not warmer than moving, and she had a meeting with a banker that she was not looking forward to, and delaying it wasn't going to improve it. She caught up to Frank Holst at the creek crossing, where he'd stopped to check the ice thickness before taking it. "Frank," she said. He turned. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something complicated and resolute at once. "Miss Holloway," he said, "you're going to Mercer's." It wasn't quite a question. "I am," she said. "You?" "Yes." He looked at the ice, decided it was sufficient, and stepped out onto it carefully. "Come on, we'll go together." She followed him across, and she didn't ask the question that was forming because she wanted to see what was happening before she put words to it and found out she'd misread it entirely. That was a thing she'd learned in 3 years of farming alone. Sometimes you waited and watched before you decided what you were seeing. Dorothy Crane fell into step beside her on the far bank. "I was going to come get you," Dorothy said, "but I figured you'd already be moving." "What's happening?" Mara asked. "People are going to talk to Mercer." "About what?" "About you." Dorothy said it like it was obvious. "About the note. About the deadline." Mara stopped walking. Dorothy took 2 more steps before she noticed and turned back. "Don't," Dorothy said. "Don't what?" "Don't make that face, and don't say what you're about to say. This isn't charity, and it isn't pity, and it isn't people feeling sorry for the woman with the rabbits." Her voice was matter-of-fact, the way Dorothy's voice always was when she'd thought something through and arrived at a conclusion she wasn't going to argue about. "Frank Holst's daughter is breathing clearly this morning because of your blanket. The alderman children slept warm last night. Pete Garner's boys haven't been to the clinic with frostbite. These are facts, Mara. People know what facts mean." Mara looked at the figures moving toward town ahead of them. "How many?" she asked. "I don't know exactly. Ruth sent word to the eastern settlement 2 days ago when the snow slowed enough to get a message through. I talked to Nellie Tanner yesterday." Dorothy paused. "People have been talking across fences and through windows for 3 days. You were out in it delivering gloves and blankets, and you didn't see it because you were too busy doing the next thing to look around." Mara didn't say anything. She started walking again. "I don't need people to fight my battles," she said after a moment. "Nobody's fighting your battle. They're telling Mercer what they know from their own experience. What you made kept their families alive through the worst storm in 30 years. That's their story to tell. Not yours to stop them from telling." She walked with that for a while. The cold was still sharp, but the sky had changed. Not warm, not promising spring, but different from the flat white ceiling of the blizzard. There was a quality of light in it that suggested the storm had spent itself, that the worst of it was behind them. She felt it in her chest, that shift, the way you feel the end of something hard even before the evidence is conclusive. "Mercer's going to call the note regardless," she said. "It's not his money. He answers to the regional office." "Let's find out," Dorothy said. Redstone Crossing looked like a town that had been through something. The storefronts were half buried, the boardwalks invisible under packed snow, the street itself a series of irregular paths broken through by whoever had come through first and widened by each person after. Icicles hung from every eave, and the general store had a crack in its front window that hadn't been there before the storm. And the livery stable's sign had come down and was propped against the wall waiting for someone to have the time to deal with it. But there were people out. More than she'd expected. Coming from the eastern settlement, from the farms north of the creek, from the scattered homesteads that were normally too far from each other for easy community. Gathering, the way frontier communities gathered when something had happened that required a gathering. Gideon Mercer's office was a modest building on the main street, between the assayer's office and the telegraph station. He kept a small waiting area in front and his desk in the back, and there was a wood stove he maintained through the winter that made the space warmer than most buildings in town. When Mara arrived, there were already 8 people in the waiting area. By the time she'd removed her coat and her outer layer of gloves, her own rabbit fur pair underneath, which she was never without now, there were 14. Mercer appeared at the door to his inner office. He looked at the crowd with an expression she'd never seen on him before, which was something close to genuine surprise. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "I believe we had an appointment." "We did." He looked at the people behind her, at Frank Holst, who had tracked snow all the way across his waiting room floor and was standing with his arms crossed in the manner of a man who had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. At Pete Garner, who'd come in behind Dorothy and was still holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly. At Ruth Alderman, who had her youngest daughter with her, the girl with the rabbit fur gloves, who was wearing them now, inside, because she hadn't taken them off since Mara had put them on her hands 3 days ago. "Come in," Mercer said. Then he looked at the crowd again. "All of you, I suppose." It was too many people for his office, which meant some of them stood in the doorway and some stood in the waiting room, and the whole arrangement had the cramped, slightly awkward quality of a meeting that hadn't been planned around the size of the room. Mercer sat behind his desk. Mara sat across from him. Everyone else found whatever position they could. "I came to tell you I can't meet the deadline," Mara said, before anyone else could speak. "The storm cost me market days. I gave away some of what I'd produced to families who needed it during the blizzard. I'm short of what you need from me by the end of December. I know what that means for the note, and I'm not here to argue about the terms. I'm here because you asked me to come before Christmas, and I'm keeping that appointment." Mercer was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen in August, the revised estimate, but more so. More complicated. Frank Holst spoke from the doorway. "My daughter had a fever for 3 days," he said. "The kind of fever that goes somewhere bad if you can't keep the child warm enough. I went to Miss Holloway's door in the middle of a blizzard because I didn't have another option, and I wasn't too proud to admit it." He paused. "She gave me the blanket, didn't ask for payment that night, told me to settle it later." Another pause. "My daughter broke the fever the next morning. I'm not saying the blanket did that. I'm saying the blanket kept her warm enough to fight it. That's not a small thing, Gideon." The room was quiet. Pete Garner cleared his throat. "My boy's hands were in bad shape. 3rd day of the storm, my oldest couldn't feel his fingers enough to work the stove latch. Miss Holloway walked out to us in conditions that I wouldn't have asked my horse to go out in, and she brought gloves for both of them." He looked at Mercer directly. "You know what frostbitten hands mean for a farmer come spring? Everybody in this room knows." Mercer said nothing. He was listening in the way he sometimes listened, completely still, giving nothing away. Ruth Alderman stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the window. She had the quiet directness Mara had noticed the first time they'd met, and it was more visible now. "My family lost our chimney pipe the first night," she said. "We went to the Holsts with nothing. The Holsts already had more people than their stove was built for. My children were sleeping in their clothes under every piece of fabric we had, and it wasn't enough." She looked at her youngest, who was examining her gloved hands with quiet contentment, apparently oblivious to the meeting happening around her. "Miss Holloway brought gloves for all 3 of them. Children's gloves, sized right, warm in a way I've never felt from a glove before." She looked back at Mercer. "I've been spinning rabbit fiber for her since October. I know what the operation is. I know how much she's built. I know what it produces." A pause. "I know what it's worth." Dorothy hadn't said anything yet, which for Dorothy was unusual enough that Mara noticed it. She was standing near the back, beside Nellie Tanner, and she had the expression of someone who had said what she needed to say before they got here and was now letting it work. Nellie Tanner spoke. She spoke quietly, in the manner of a woman who didn't waste words, which was why the room paid attention. "My son has been working that operation since spring," she said. "I thought she was foolish at first. I said so, and I wasn't quiet about it. I was wrong, and I'm saying so now, and I'm not quiet about that either." She met Mercer's eyes. "What she's built is real. The soil recovery is real. Go look at that south field if you need proof. The fiber is real. The warmth is real. My Eli has better judgment than most adults I know, and he's been telling me since June that she was doing something important. He was right. She stopped. Then quietly, I should have listened to my son. The room was silent for a moment after that. Mercer leaned back in his chair. He had his hands flat on the desk, and he was looking at them, at his own large hands, and then he looked up at Mara. You gave away inventory during the storm, he said. Yes. Inventory you needed for the December figures. Yes. Why? She looked at him. Because Pete Garner's boys had bad hands, and the alderman children were cold, and I had gloves. The answer to that isn't complicated, Mr. Mercer. No, he said slowly. I suppose it isn't. He was quiet for long enough that the room started to feel the weight of it. People shifted. Someone near the door coughed from the cold they'd brought in with them. The regional office, Mercer said, gave me discretion on how to handle extended accounts. I told you that they required a payment schedule review. What I did not tell you was that the discretion on outcome was mine. Mara looked at him. I have been sitting with this since the storm started, he said, which gave me considerable time to sit with it, given that I wasn't going anywhere either. He picked up his pen and put it down again. I am not indifferent to what you've built. I said that in November and I meant it. But I'm a banker, and bankers deal in evidence, and the evidence I had in November was promising but incomplete. And now? Dorothy said from the back. He looked at Dorothy. And now 14 people are in my office in the week after the worst blizzard in 30 years, and half of them can tell me specific stories about how a product from the Holloway operation kept their families functional during a crisis. He picked up the pen again, and this time he held it. That's not a promise. That's not potential. That's demonstrated value to this community, which is a different category of evidence. Mara was watching him carefully. She'd learned in the months of dealings with this man that he said things that meant more than their surface, and that the difference between what he said and what he meant was worth tracking. What are you telling me? She asked. I'm telling you that I'm going to restructure the note. He said it without preamble, without softening. Extended repayment period, reduced immediate payment requirement, with a schedule tied to your demonstrated revenue rather than a fixed deadline. He looked at her directly. This is not forgiveness of the debt. The principal is still owed. The interest still accrues, though at a rate I'm going to revisit. What changes is the timeline and the terms. She let that land. Why? She said. The same word he'd used on her. Because calling this note in February destroys an operation that has shown genuine community value in a crisis. That's bad banking. He said it flatly. And because you came to this office in the middle of December, after a week in a blizzard, to keep an appointment you didn't have to keep, that tells me something about the kind of person I'm extending credit to. Frank Holst made a sound in the doorway that might have been approval. There are conditions, Mercer said. There always are. You formalize the arrangement with the women who are spinning for you. Written contracts, clear accounting, nothing informal. If this operation is going to serve the community the way it apparently already is, it needs to be structured like a business, not a household project. Agreed. You bring me monthly figures starting in February. Revenue, costs, inventory, projections. I want to understand what you're building, not just hear about it after the fact. Agreed. And he paused. He was looking at the youngest alderman girl who had finally noticed the adults watching her and was looking back at them with the unconcerned directness of a small child. And you teach someone else what you know, about the soil amendment, about the fiber processing. Whatever you've learned that worked. One other person, at minimum, so that what you figured out doesn't only exist in your head. She hadn't expected that one. She sat with it for a moment. Why does that matter to you? She asked. Because useful knowledge that lives in one person is a liability, he said. And what you've learned is useful. He set his pen down with the small, precise movement she'd come to recognize as him finishing a thought. Those are the conditions. Do you want time to consider them? No, she said. The crowd in the waiting room had thinned by the time she came out. People with farms to get back to, animals to check, the accumulated work of 8 storm days to begin addressing. But a core of them had stayed, and they were standing in the cold outside the office, breath clouding in the winter air, and when she came through the door, they looked at her. Frank Holst was still there. Dorothy, Ruth Alderman with her daughter, Pete Garner, Nellie Tanner. Well, Dorothy said, he's restructuring the note. Dorothy nodded as though she'd expected nothing else, which was either confidence or retrospective certainty, and Mara didn't try to determine which. Frank Holst put his hat back on. "Good," he said, in the tone of a man who had more to say and was choosing not to say it, which she appreciated. Pete Garner stepped forward. "Miss Holloway, I said 2 days of the boys' labor in the spring. I meant it, and I'm keeping it." "I know you will," she said. "And we've been talking on the way here." He glanced at the others. "The Birch family lost most of their root vegetable stock in the storm, cellar flooding. They've got hands available if you need help expanding the hutch row come spring. Tom Birch is—" He stopped. "Tom Birch doesn't need to apologize to me," she said. "He knows that. He's still going to." She was quiet for a moment. The cold was working its way back in now that she wasn't moving, and she pulled her coat tighter. "I need to get back to the rabbits," she said. "They'll need the afternoon feeding." "We'll walk you out," Dorothy said. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." Dorothy picked up her bag from where she'd set it against the building. "Mara, let people walk with you. It doesn't cost you anything." She stood there in the cold outside Gideon Mercer's office, and she looked at the people who had walked into a blizzard aftermath to stand in a too-small room and say what they'd seen. And she thought about the word charity and how she'd been afraid of it, and how what was standing in front of her was not that. Charity was one-directional. What this was, this exchange of what she'd built for what they were offering, was something else. It was the kind of thing that frontier communities either figured out or they didn't. The kind of thing that was the difference between a collection of people surviving individually and a community surviving together. She had built something that helped them. They were helping her continue to build it. That wasn't charity. That was just what a community was when it was working. "All right," she said, "let's go." They walked back out of town together through the snow. A loose and uneven group spread across the packed road, and they talked about things that weren't the meeting, about the storm damage, about what needed doing in the weeks ahead, about whose barn roof had taken the worst of the weight and who had lumber to spare for repairs. Ruth Alderman fell into step beside Mara, her daughter between them, the girl's gloved hand in her mother's. "The condition about teaching someone what you know," Ruth said. "What about it?" "He meant someone singular. I think you should teach more than one." Mara looked at her. "I know the fiber processing better than I did 6 months ago," Ruth said. "Nellie knows the spinning better than anyone in the county now. Dorothy knows the yarn construction." She was quiet for a moment. "What none of us know is the soil work, the manure amendment, the rotation schedule, what to watch for in the field." She paused. "Teach me that. Your land isn't the same as mine. The drainage is different. The clay shelf runs deeper on your side. Then teach me how to read it for my land. I'm not asking you to hand me a formula. I'm asking you to teach me how to think about it." She looked straight ahead at the road. "You figured it out from pamphlets and failure. I can do the same with you telling me where to start." Mara walked with that for a while. She thought about what Mercer had said. Useful knowledge that lives in one person is a liability. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent on that ground, learning it the hard way, making mistakes that a teacher could have shortened by half. "Come on Saturday," she said. "I'll be there." Chum. Eli was at the homestead when she got back, which surprised her until it didn't. He was in the hutch row, doing the afternoon feeding with the efficiency of someone who had done it enough times to have his own system, and he looked up when she came through the gate. "How did it go?" he asked. She told him, walking the hutch row beside him while he worked, her voice level and factual the way she tried to keep things when she was still processing them. He listened without asking questions, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, distributing hay to the last row. "So you keep the land," he said. "I keep the land." He nodded. He was doing the thing again where he wasn't filling the silence with noise. "Eli," she said. "Yeah, what you said, a few weeks ago. About what warmth is worth when you don't have it." She stopped at the end of the hutch row, looking down the line of 62 animals going about the uncomplicated business of eating hay. "You were right, about what I was missing." He looked at her sideways. "I didn't say anything that useful." "You said enough." She looked at the rabbits. "You've been here since March. You helped build this. Eli, you helped build this. She said it clearly because he was 14 years old and had spent months showing up at her fence line for whatever she could afford to pay him, and she wanted him to know what that had been worth because nobody had said it plainly. When this starts producing real income in the spring, I'm going to pay you accordingly. Not Eli runs errands wages. A real wage for someone who helped build something real. He opened his mouth, closed it. Yes, ma'am, he said finally, very quietly. She looked at the rabbits for another moment, 62 of them, alive, warm, eating hay while the winter settled around them. She had come to this county alone, and she was still alone in the specific ways. No family, no husband, the fundamental solitude of being the person who made every decision and bore every consequence. That hadn't changed. She wasn't going to pretend the last year had transformed her into something other than what she was. But something else was different now. She'd built something that mattered beyond herself. She'd built it out of 64 unwanted animals and depleted soil and stubbornness and $31 in a tin box. And it had mattered when mattering was the difference between a child's fever breaking and not breaking, between a man's hands working in the spring and not working. That was real. Whatever happened next, that was real, and it was hers, and nobody could take the truth of it back. She went inside to do the evening accounting because Gideon Mercer wanted monthly figures starting in February, and she was going to give him figures that left no room for doubt. She put fresh oil in the lamp. She got out the ledger she'd been keeping since March. She sat down in the lamplight, in her kitchen, on her land, and she began to write down everything she knew. The ledger she started that December evening became, over the following months, the most important document on the Holloway homestead. Not because it proved anything dramatic, not because the numbers were staggering or the growth was the kind of thing that made for a clean success story, but because it was honest, and because honesty, when you've been fighting for your life on paper, is the most useful thing you can put in a room with a banker. She brought it to Mercer in February, as agreed, and she set it on his desk and sat across from him and let him read it without explaining it. She'd learned by then that explaining numbers while someone else was reading them was a way of making the numbers seem less certain than they were. And her numbers, for the first time in 3 years, did not need defending. Revenue from glove sales, up significantly from the previous quarter. The storm had done something she hadn't planned for. It had turned rabbit fur gloves from a local curiosity into a demonstrated necessity, and people were ordering them the way they ordered practical things rather than the way they ordered luxuries. Families who had watched their neighbors survive the blizzard with warm hands were not waiting to see if the next winter would be as bad. They were buying now. The blanket orders were slower but growing. She'd finished 4 more since December, pricing them higher than she'd initially planned because Dorothy had told her she was undervaluing them, and Dorothy had been right. 2 had gone to families she knew. 2 had gone to buyers she didn't know. People from the next county over who'd heard about them through a chain of word of mouth she couldn't fully trace. Costs were what they were. Feed for 62 rabbits, oil for the lamp, fair wages for Nellie and Ruth and the other 2 women spinning, the materials she needed for construction. She hadn't cut any of it. She'd been tempted to cut the wages in the lean weeks between Christmas and February, and she hadn't, partly because it was wrong, and partly because the women who were spinning were the reason she had product to sell. And undermining that to save short-term money was the kind of decision that destroyed operations that had been worth building. Mercer read through all of it. He turned pages. He went back to check figures. He did the quiet arithmetic of a man who had been reading accounts for 20 years and knew what mattered in them. When he looked up, his expression was the most straightforward she'd seen from him. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. He almost smiled at that. Almost. "The blanket pricing is still too low," he said. Dorothy said the same thing. Dorothy Crane is occasionally correct. More than occasionally, and she'd tell you so herself. This time he did smile, briefly, the way a man smiles who doesn't do it often enough to be comfortable with it. He adjusted the repayment schedule in front of her, revising 2 figures based on the February revenue, and he showed her the math, which she appreciated. She'd always appreciated that he showed her the math rather than presenting conclusions, as though they'd come from somewhere she wasn't authorized to look. "March is going to be stronger," she said. "The East Field is ready for planting, first real crop from amended soil. If the yield is what I think it will be, the farm income starts contributing to the repayment alongside the fiber operation." What crop? Oats and a kitchen garden section. Nothing ambitious. The soil needs a successful season more than it needs a heroic one. He nodded. Sensible. I've been sensible all along, she said. It just didn't look like it from the outside. He looked at her for a moment. No, he agreed. It didn't. No. Spring came the way spring comes after a brutal winter. Not gently, but with the relief of a thing that was overdue. The snow retreated in stages, reluctantly, leaving the ground saturated and soft in a way that was difficult to work, but deeply promising for someone who understood what moisture meant in soil that had been properly amended. Mara planted the East Field in the second week of April, working alongside Pete Garner's oldest boy, who showed up as promised and proved himself worth twice what she'd asked for. His name was Daniel, and he was 15 and strong and had the particular quality of a young person who worked without needing to be watched, which was worth more than almost any other quality in a farmhand. The South Field, her first experiment, her proof of concept, she planted in oats and watched with the attention of someone who had invested a year of their life and a significant portion of their fear into a piece of ground. Ruth Alderman came on Saturdays, as she'd been doing since January, and Mara taught her the soil work the way she'd told her she would. Not with formulas, but with observation, with the practice of looking at what the ground was showing you and understanding what it meant. They'd start at the edge of the South Field, and Mara would ask questions rather than make statements, because that was how she'd learned it herself, by being forced to look at something and try to name what she saw. What's different about the soil color in this section versus that one? She'd ask. Ruth would crouch down and look, for real, not the reflexive look of someone waiting to be told the answer. Darker here. Richer. Why? Because the amendment went in heavier here in the fall. Partly. What else? Ruth would think. She'd pick up a handful and feel it, which was something Mara had started doing herself almost unconsciously, and which she'd never seen described in any pamphlet. It was just what you learned to do when you spent enough time with a particular piece of ground. The drainage is better here. The clay shelf drops away. So the organic matter stayed in the root zone instead of washing. Right. Ruth would stand up, knock the soil off her hands. So for my east acreage, where the clay runs deep all the way across, you'd compensate with drainage channels before you amend. Otherwise, you're enriching the wrong layer. Ruth absorbed this without writing it down, which Mara had initially worried about and had stopped worrying about when she realized that Ruth's memory for land observation was as reliable as a ledger. You should be charging for this, Ruth said one Saturday in March, looking at the South Field beginning to show the first green haze of early growth. I'm charging you in labor hours you've put into the spinning. That's not the same. No, but it's sufficient. She looked at the field. Mercer told me to teach one person. I've taught you and Eli half of what I know about soil work, and Dorothy more than she'd admit about fiber grades, and Nellie has figured out the spinning technique better than I have at this point. So, she paused. Maybe that was what I needed to do all along, and I just needed someone to make it a condition. Ruth made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had some of the same content. You didn't need the condition, she said. You would have done it anyway. You're just the kind of person who does things better when you're annoyed about being told to do them. Mara opened her mouth and closed it. That's accurate, she said, finally. The spring market opened in May, and it was different from any market day she'd attended in 3 years on this land. Different not because of the crowds. The crowd was what it always was. Frontier commerce conducting itself with the practical efficiency of people who had too much to do to browse. Different because of what she brought, and because of how people stopped at her table. She had gloves in 7 sizes, organized by type. Working weight for outdoor labor, lighter weight for general wear. A children's line she'd developed in February because the Alderman girl had outgrown hers and come to ask for new ones. She had 2 blankets priced at the number Dorothy had told her to price them at. She had a small display of raw yarn in 3 weights that she'd started selling to women in the county who wanted to knit their own items, which was a market she hadn't anticipated, and which Ruth had pointed out was essentially free revenue because the raw material required no additional labor beyond what was already happening in the processing. Nellie Tanner ran the table beside her selling the same yarn under a joint accounting arrangement they'd worked out in February, which had taken 2 attempts to get right because both of them had opinions about fair division and neither of them was comfortable ceding the last word. They'd gotten there. Tom Birch came to the table. She had been waiting for this without knowing she was waiting for it. He was a blocky man in his late 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd farmed hard ground his whole life, and he had been, by Eli's accounting, one of the more persistent voices of skepticism about the rabbits and about her in general. He stood at the table and looked at the gloves and did not look at her. "How much for a pair of the working weight?" he asked Nellie. Nellie told him the price. He picked up a pair and turned them over. "I'll take 2, he said. Then, without turning as if he was talking to the gloves rather than to either of the women behind the table, "Pete Garner says the South Field looks like different land." "It's the same land," Mara said, "just amended." He set the gloves down and finally looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had something to say that he hadn't figured out how to say yet, and he was going to say it badly, and he knew it, and he was going to say it anyway. "I was wrong," he said, "about the rabbits." She looked at him. "I said things I shouldn't have said. That's—" He stopped. "I thought you were going to fall. I thought it was a matter of time. I've seen people fall on that land before." "I know," she said. "It's not a kind piece of ground." "No." He picked up the gloves again. "My father lost a friend on that land 40 years ago. Good man, bad seasons, couldn't make it work. So when I saw you—" He stopped again. "I wasn't being cruel. I was being certain," she said. "You were being certain, and you were wrong." "Yes, Tom." She waited until he looked at her. "2 pairs of working weight, and if you've got hands that run big, try the 3rd size down from what you're thinking. The fur compresses differently than wool." He blinked. "Right," he said. He picked up the smaller size. The summer was work. That was the honest description of it. It was work without the desperation that had underlined the previous 2 summers. But work nonetheless, because building something real is not one dramatic season of effort followed by ease. It's seasons, accumulated, each one building on what came before. The Eastfield's first crop from amended soil came in stronger than she dared to project to Mercer, though not dramatically so. Not the kind of yield that made a person believe the land had been transformed overnight. It was the yield of soil that was on its way back, that had been given what it needed and was beginning to respond. That would be better next year than it was this year, and better the year after that. It was the yield of patience, which is not the same as the yield of magic, and she had learned the difference. She brought Mercer the June figures in person because she'd decided that was worth doing. Not because she was required to, but because she wanted to be present when the numbers were read rather than letting them arrive as paper and be interpreted without her. He read them. He did his arithmetic. "You're ahead of the schedule," he said. "I know." Meaningfully ahead. "The blanket pricing," she said. "Dorothy was right. She usually is," he said, and this time there was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. He set the ledger down. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since December, the revised estimate, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "I've had 2 inquiries from families in the next county," he said, "about the rabbit fur products. Not for themselves. They want to understand the production model. One of them has land he thinks could support a rabbit operation if he understood how to do it." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I'd ask the person who built it whether she was interested in talking to them." She sat with that. She thought about what she'd said to Ruth in March, that maybe teaching was what she'd needed to do all along, and she just needed to be told to do it. She thought about the condition Mercer had put in the restructured note, and how she'd been annoyed by it and had done it anyway, and had found, in the doing of it, that it changed something about how she understood what she'd built. Useful knowledge that lives in one person is a liability. "Tell them to come," she said. They came in July. 2 men, one from the Eastern Valley and one from the county above. Practical, land-weathered men who asked specific questions and wrote things down, which she appreciated. She walked them through the hutch row, now expanded to accommodate a herd that had grown carefully over the spring. Additional does integrated with the attention of someone who understood that growth without management was just a different kind of chaos. She talked about soil amendment the way Ruth had taught her to talk about it, by asking them questions about their own land before she said anything prescriptive. She talked about the fiber processing with the honest account of what worked and what she'd had to figure out by failing at it repeatedly, because that was more useful than a clean version that made it sound simpler than it was. Eli was there showing the men the hutch construction he'd helped design, explaining the drainage system with the proprietary pride of someone who'd built something worth explaining. She watched him from across the yard and thought about the gap between who he'd been when he first showed up at her fence line, that curious 14-year-old with the hammer and no explanation, and who he was now. He was taller, for one thing. He'd grown through the winter the way boys do, suddenly and inconveniently, and he'd grown in other ways that were harder to measure. He talked about the operation with a fluency that came from actually understanding it, not just having watched it, and the men from the other counties were listening to him with the attention they gave to competent people. After the visitors left, he came to find her at the South Field, where she was doing her end-of-day check on the oat crop, which was 2 weeks from harvest and looking like something she was going to let herself be proud of. "You're going to teach them," he said. "Going to try." "You think they'll do it right?" "I think they'll do it the way I did it. Make mistakes, figure it out, do it better." She looked at the oats, moving slightly in the late afternoon air. "The knowledge doesn't belong to me, Eli. I learned it from pamphlets written by people I've never met, and from Dorothy and Ruth, and from failing at things until they worked. It doesn't belong to me." He was quiet for a moment. "What does belong to you?" She thought about that. "The land," she said. "The work I put into it. The relationships. The understanding that there's a difference between those things and the knowledge itself." She paused. "And 62 rabbits." 68, he said. "The April litter." 68 rabbits. The first anniversary of the day she'd driven to Walt Cutler's place came in March of the following year, and she didn't mark it with anything ceremonial because she wasn't a ceremonial person and there was too much to do. But she noticed it. She stood in the hutch row in the early morning, doing the first feeding of the day in the way she'd done it every morning for a year, and she counted the animals, 68 now, with another litter expected from 3 of the does within the month. And she thought about the woman who had stood in the mud outside a slaughter pen and paid $4 for animals nobody wanted. She had not been brave, exactly. Bravery implied that she'd known the risk and chosen it with clear eyes. What she'd been was desperate and stubborn and in possession of a pamphlet about nitrogen content that she'd read enough times to have memorized, and she'd made a decision that looked like foolishness from every practical angle except the one she was standing on. That was the thing nobody talked about, honestly, when they told stories about people who did something improbable and made it work. They left out the part where the person didn't know if it was going to work. They left out the 3 in the morning arithmetic, the months of watching neighbors' expressions for the specific kind of pity that meant they'd given up on you, the December day when you looked at your numbers and knew they weren't enough and had to walk into a banker's office and say so. They left out the loss. The doe who died in the first blizzard night, curled small and still in her corner. The season of crops that failed before the soil came back. The money spent on feeding 62 animals through a winter that could have taken everything. The version of this story that got told later by other people was tidier than the thing itself had been. It was the version where Mara Holloway had a vision and executed it, and the county came around and everything worked out. That version was not wrong, exactly, but it was missing the texture of how it had actually felt, the weight of the days when she was not certain, which was most of them. She had not been certain. She had been persistent, which was different. Persistence doesn't require certainty. It requires only the decision to continue past the point where certainty would have been comforting. Ruth Alderman's East Acreage showed its first signs of real soil recovery in April, 14 months after she'd started the amendment work. She came to tell Mara about it on a Tuesday morning, arriving at the gate with the particular brightness of someone who has just been proven right about something they'd been working toward for a long time. "Come see it," she said. They walked to Ruth's land together, which was 20 minutes on foot in the spring mud, and Ruth showed her the section she'd been treating, a 1/4 acre of ground that had been thin and pale the previous spring and was now something visibly different. Not transformed, not the dramatic green of good soil in a wet spring, but different, changed in the direction of what it was supposed to be. Mara crouched down and touched it. It had the texture and the smell she recognized, alive in the particular way that soil became alive when you gave it what it needed and got out of the way. "It's going to be slow," Mara said. "I know it's going to be slow. You told me that at least 4 times. "I told you because people don't believe it when they read it, and they don't fully believe it when you say it, and then it's slow and they're disappointed." "I'm not disappointed," Ruth said. She was standing with her arms crossed against the April wind, looking at her own ground with an expression that Mara recognized from the inside. "This is exactly what you said it would be. It's going to be better in the fall." "I know. And better the spring after." "I know, Mara." They stood there in the mud for a while, 2 women looking at a 1/4 acre of ground that was in the process of becoming something it hadn't been before. And the wind came down off the ridge the way it always did, and it was cold but not cruel, and the sky above them was the clear, pale blue of a spring morning that meant what it looked like. "We should expand the spinning arrangement," Ruth said after a while. "I've been thinking the same thing. If the 2 families from the other counties get their operations running by fall, they'll need somewhere to sell the raw fiber. If they sell it to us and we process it, the capacity grows without the capital outlay of expanding the herd." Mara looked at her sideways. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since February. And you're telling me now." "I was waiting to see if the soil amendment worked first. Didn't want to plan an expansion on top of a problem." She laughed. An actual laugh, not a polite one. The kind that came up without permission because something was genuinely funny and also genuinely true. Ruth had just described, in precise terms, the principle Mara had been operating on for 2 years without ever articulating it. "That's right," she said. "That's exactly right." By the following winter, the Holloway operation, which was what it was starting to be called, not by Mara, but by the people who worked with it and bought from it, and in 2 cases had built smaller versions of it on their own land, was a different thing than it had been when it was 64 unwanted rabbits headed for a slaughter pen. It was not large. She wanted to be honest about that, because the stories that got told about things like this had a way of becoming larger than they were. It was a working homestead with a viable fiber operation, a soil amendment practice that she was teaching to whoever came to learn it, and a set of relationships with the county that had been built slowly and tested hard and had held. The debt to Mercer was not paid off. It was being paid on a schedule she was meeting with figures she brought him every month in person because she'd decided that was how she was going to do business, and she'd kept to it. He looked at her ledgers with the focused attention of a man who had stopped being surprised by them and had started being interested in them, which was a different and better relationship. "You're going to be clear of this within 2 years, he said one November morning, looking at the latest figures. "I know. You don't seem particularly excited about that." She thought about it. "I'm excited about what the land is going to produce when I'm not spending energy on the debt," she said. "The pain of it is just math. It's the after that's interesting." He looked at her for a moment. "What's the after?" "The North Field needs 1 more year of amendment before it's ready to plant properly. When it is, the farm is producing at a level that doesn't require the fiber income to carry it. They can grow together instead of one propping the other up." She paused. "And I want to build a proper processing room, off the barn, climate-controlled enough to do the fiber work year-round without losing quality in the summer heat. That's capital." "I know, I'll save it." "You could apply for—" "I'll save it," she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as something between respect and exasperation, which was fine. She'd earned the right to her own judgment about debt. Eli Tanner turned 16 in January and came to her on a cold Tuesday morning with a look she recognized as someone who had something to say they'd been rehearsing. "I want to talk about next year," he said. She poured him coffee. He was tall enough now that she'd stopped noticing it as a change, and it had just become how he looked. A young man rather than a boy, which had happened gradually and then seemed suddenly complete. "Talk," she said. "My father wants me to work his land full-time starting next spring," he said. "He needs the help. I know that. It's fair." He held the coffee cup. "But I also want to keep working here, and I don't know how to do both." She looked at him. "What did you tell your father?" "That I'd think about it." "And your mother?" He almost smiled. "Mama said I should talk to you first." "Your mother is a practical woman." She set down her own cup. "Eli, you've been here since you were 14. You helped build this from when it was a row of hutches and 64 scared animals, and nobody in the county thought it was going to work. She paused. I'm not going to tell you what to do about your father's land. That's yours to figure out, and it matters. But the operation here is real now. It has people who work it. Ruth, Nellie, the others. It doesn't live in me alone anymore, which is what it needed to be, and I know you're part of why it got there. She looked at him directly. If you need to be at your father's land, that's right, and I'll work around it. If there's a way to do both, I'll work around that too. What I won't do is pretend that what you've put into this place isn't worth keeping you in it, if that's what you decide. He was quiet for a long moment. What you said about the knowledge not belonging to you, he said finally, about it belonging to the people who taught you and the people you teach. Yes. I've been thinking about that since July. He turned the cup in his hands. I want to be the person who teaches it, not just here. I want to understand it well enough to, I don't know exactly, but more than one farm. She looked at him for a long time. Then learn everything you can learn here and everything you can learn at your father's land. And don't be in a hurry. She picked up her cup. You're 16. You don't have to know what you're building yet. You just have to keep building. He nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, he said. Cool. There is something that people who have survived difficult things understand about what comes after, and it is this. The after is not the reward. It is just more life. It has its own difficulties, its own seasons of uncertainty, its own moments of 3 in the morning arithmetic that doesn't add up. The things you built don't protect you from future problems. They give you a different set of resources with which to face them. Mara Holloway did not become a person without worry. She became a person whose worries were different. The land that had been failing was coming back, and the land coming back created new decisions. What to plant, how to scale, when to hold, and when to expand. The operation that had been a gamble was becoming a business, and a business has its own demands, its own learning curve, its own ways of humbling a person who thought they understood it. She was still up at 3 in the morning sometimes, running numbers. But the numbers were different numbers, and the feeling in her chest when she ran them was different too. Not the cold weight of survival, but the more complicated weight of someone who has built something and is now responsible for keeping it worth having built. She stood at the edge of the south field one evening in late November, the second fall after the rabbits, with the cold coming down off the ridge the way it always did, and the last light going out of the sky the way it always did, and she looked at what was in front of her. The field was dark and banked for winter, resting after a harvest she'd been quietly proud of in the way she let herself be proud of things, without performance, just with the quiet knowledge of what it had cost to get there. The hutch row was full, the animals warm, the new winter insulation she and Daniel Garner had installed in October doing exactly what it was designed to do. From here she could see the light in Ruth Alderman's direction, a half-mile east, from a house where Saturday morning soil lessons had become something else, a friendship. The particular kind that builds between people who have worked on something real together. Eli would come Tuesday. He'd worked out an arrangement with his father that gave him 2 days a week here and kept his obligations there intact, and it was complicated and imperfect, and it was working. Dorothy would come Sunday, as she'd been doing for more than a year, in the way that had never been named and didn't need to be. The debt would be paid. The North Field would recover. The processing room would be built when she had the money for it, which she would have because she'd learned how to read the trajectory of a thing, and this thing was on the right trajectory. None of that was certain. She'd stopped needing it to be. What she had learned, what 68 rabbits and a depleted field and a brutal winter and a community that came around slowly and imperfectly had taught her, was that certainty was not the point. You could not wait for certainty and build anything real. You built on the best understanding you had, and you paid attention, and you corrected when you were wrong, and you kept going when the correction was painful. And sometimes, not always, not on a schedule, not as a reward for doing things right, you stood at the edge of a field that had come back from what looked like the dead, and you felt something that was not triumph and not relief, and not even exactly happiness, but was something quieter and more durable than any of those. You felt that you were in the right place, doing the right thing, and that the doing of it had made you into someone you could live with. She'd come to this land with $31 and a stubbornness her parents had probably worried about, and a pamphlet about nitrogen content she'd read until the edges were soft. She was still here. So was the land. That, she thought, walking back toward the house in the last light, was enough. It was more than enough. It was if she was being honest about it, and she had learned to be honest about things, even the ones that didn't make clean stories. It was everything she had asked for, in the only language she knew how to ask in. The language of getting up in the morning, the language of doing the work, the language that said, without words, I am still here, and this matters, and I will not stop. She went inside. She put the lamp on. She opened the ledger. She had a business to run.